The first time I ever saw my husband truly afraid was at 7:12 on a Tuesday morning. Richard Wheeler stood in our kitchen gripping his phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. "What do you mean, frozen?" he shouted. "All of them, that's impossible. For 34 years. Richard had told everyone that I knew nothing about money. He laughed when I asked questions. He rolled his eyes when I mentioned finances. He made sure our children believed he was the expert and I was just the wife. But as I watched him panic over the bank's decision, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace, because unlike Richard, I wasn't surprised. I had known this day was coming. I just never imagined how much of his life would collapse when it finally arrived. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who thought they knew better, I'd love to hear your story. Please like and subscribe if you enjoy emotional family dramas like this one. And before we continue, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. I'm always amazed to see how far these stories travel. My name is Lori Wheeler. And for most of my adult life, people believed I didn't understand money. That wasn't an accident. It was a story my husband carefully built over decades. When I met Richard Wheeler, I was 28 years old and working as a bookkeeping assistant for a small manufacturing company outside Columbus, Ohio. I wasn't wealthy. I didn't come from a powerful family, but I was organized, practical, and good with numbers. My father used to joke that I balanced my allowance ledger more carefully than some businesses balance their books. I liked numbers because they told the truth. People lied. Numbers rarely did. Richard was different from anyone I had dated before. Confident, ambitious, charismatic, the kind of man who could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with a dozen new friends. He owned a small trucking company when we met. Nothing impressive at the time. Just a handful of vehicles and a dream that seemed much bigger than his reality. I admired that. Back then, he admired me too. At least I thought he did. We married 2 years later. The first few years were good. We worked together. We planned together. We talked about everything when our son, Ethan, was born. Things began to change. Not suddenly. Gradually. Almost invisibly. Richard's company started growing. 1 contract became 3. 3 became 10. Within a decade, he had transformed a modest business into a successful regional logistics company. The more money he made, the more important he seemed to become, and the less important I became. When Ethan was 5 and our daughter Megan was born, we made a decision that seemed practical at the time. I would stay home with the children. It wasn't a sacrifice I regretted. I loved being their mother. I attended every school event. I packed every lunch. I sat through every soccer game, every dance recital, every parent conference. While Richard built his business, I built our family for many years. I believed both contributions mattered equally. Then little comments started appearing, small enough to ignore, sharp enough to hurt. The first one came during a dinner party with friends. Someone asked a question about investments. Before I could answer, Richard laughed. "Oh, don't ask Lori." Everyone chuckled. "Why?" one of our friends asked. Richard grinned. "Because if Lori handled our finances, we'd probably be living under a bridge." The table erupted with laughter. I laughed too. That's what wives were supposed to do. Right. But later that night, I remember staring at the ceiling and wondering why the joke bothered me so much. After all, I knew he didn't mean it. At least I thought he didn't. Years passed. The jokes became more frequent. Then they stopped sounding like jokes. Whenever financial topics came up, Richard would interrupt. Money isn't really your thing, Lori. Or, trust me, sweetheart, this stuff gets complicated. Or, my personal favorite. You worry too much because you don't understand how business works. The strange thing was that people believed him, even our children, especially our children. Ethan grew up watching his father make financial decisions. He heard the jokes. He heard the dismissive comments. Eventually, he stopped seeing me as someone with experience and started seeing me the way Richard described me, as someone who simply didn't understand. One Thanksgiving, when Ethan was in his late 20s, he asked Richard for investment advice. I happened to mention a different perspective. Nothing dramatic. Just another way of looking at risk. Ethan smiled politely. Then he turned back to his father. Dad probably understands it better. I remember the sting of those words. Not because Ethan intended to hurt me, because he genuinely believed them. Richard had spent years teaching him to. Megan was different. She inherited my tendency to observe before speaking. Even when she was young, she noticed things others missed. But after college, she moved to Colorado and built her own life. She wasn't around enough to see how things were changing inside our home. Or maybe she saw more than I realized. As Richard's company grew larger, he became increasingly secretive about finances. At first, I didn't question it. Many couples divide responsibilities. I trusted my husband. Why wouldn't I? But gradually, information disappeared. I stopped receiving statements. I stopped seeing tax documents. When I asked questions, answers became shorter, vaguer, more defensive. Everything's handled. That became Richard's favorite phrase. Everything's handled. I heard it so often that eventually I stopped asking, at least outwardly. Inside, something felt wrong. I couldn't explain it. There wasn't one dramatic incident. There wasn't a smoking gun. Just a growing feeling that the man sitting across from me every evening wasn't telling me everything. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night and find Richard downstairs, not watching television, not reading, working, studying documents, sending emails. The moment he heard my footsteps, his laptop screen would close. His expression would change. Too quickly, too deliberately. What are you doing? I'd ask. Just business. Always business. One evening, about 6 months before everything began to unravel, I noticed something unusual. Richard received a phone call. The moment he saw the number, he left the room. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but I could hear his voice from the hallway. Low, urgent, nervous. I'd never heard Richard sound nervous before. When he returned, I asked who called. A client. His answer came too quickly. The conversation ended there. But the feeling didn't. A few weeks later, I noticed he was traveling more frequently. Chicago, Denver, Atlanta. Trips that seemed to appear suddenly. Trips that required little explanation. Trips that somehow never included me. Whenever I suggested joining him, he found an excuse. It's work. You'd be bored. Too many meetings. At first, I accepted those explanations. Then I started noticing how rehearsed they sounded, like lines memorized long ago. For the first time in our marriage, I found myself wondering whether I truly knew my husband anymore. Not the young man I had fallen in love with. The man he had become. The successful businessman. The respected community leader. The financial genius everyone admired. The man who spent decades convincing the world that his wife knew nothing about money. The more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. Because the truth was simple. I had never forgotten what I learned. I had never stopped understanding numbers. I had simply stopped arguing. And those are two very different things. One rainy afternoon, while organizing old family documents in our study, I found a dusty storage box filled with records from years earlier. Tax returns, mortgage paperwork, insurance files, the kinds of things most people ignore. As I sorted through them, I realized something unsettling. Many of the documents I expected to see from recent years were missing, not misplaced. Missing. Completely absent. And for the first time, a thought crossed my mind that I couldn't shake. What if Richard wasn't hiding information because he thought I wouldn't understand it? What if he was hiding it because he knew I would? That question stayed with me long after I closed the box. And before long, I would discover just how dangerous the answer really was. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning. If Richard hadn't reacted the way he did, I might never have remembered it. I was watering the flowers on our front porch when the mail truck stopped at the curb. The neighborhood was quiet. The sky was clear. Nothing seemed unusual. Our mail carrier slid several envelopes into the box and continued down the street. A few minutes later, I walked outside to collect them. Utility bills, advertisements, a magazine, and one official-looking envelope from a bank. Not unusual. Richard received banking correspondence all the time. I carried the stack inside and set it on the kitchen counter. Then I went upstairs to finish folding laundry. A few minutes later, I heard the front door open. Richard had returned home unexpectedly. He was supposed to be at the office. I heard his footsteps move quickly across the kitchen. Then I heard silence. The kind of silence that makes you pay attention. When I walked downstairs, Richard was standing by the counter. The stack of mail had been opened. Most of it remained untouched, except for one envelope. The bank envelope. His face looked strange. Not frightened. Not exactly, but tense, like someone trying very hard not to appear worried. The moment he saw me, he folded the document and slipped it into his briefcase. Too quickly. Too deliberately. "What was that?" I asked casually. "What?" "The letter." He shrugged. "Nothing important." I smiled. "Then why hide it?" His jaw tightened. "It's business paperwork." That answer again? Business. Always business. I poured myself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. "What kind of business paperwork?" Richard laughed lightly. The same laugh he used whenever he wanted a conversation to end. "You wouldn't be interested." I stared at him. "Try me. For a second." Something flickered across his face. Annoyance. Then it vanished. "It's just investment paperwork." I nodded slowly. Then I changed the subject, at least outwardly. Inside, alarms were beginning to ring. Because I had seen something before, he folded the paper. Only a few words, but enough to stick in my mind. Account review. Suspicious transfer. Joint liability. The phrases flashed through my thoughts the rest of the day. I didn't mention them. I didn't confront him. I simply watched. And the more I watched, the stranger Richard became. That evening, he barely touched his dinner. He checked his phone constantly. Several times he stepped outside to take calls. Each time he returned looking more irritated, more distracted, more nervous. After 34 years of marriage, I knew Richard's habits. I knew the rhythm of his moods. This wasn't normal. Around 10 o'clock that night, he announced he was going to bed. I waited another hour before going upstairs myself. When I entered our bedroom, he appeared asleep. His breathing was steady. His eyes were closed, but something felt off. His briefcase sat beside the bed, locked. Richard never locked his briefcase at home. Never. That small detail bothered me more than it should have. I climbed into bed and stared at the ceiling. The words from the letter repeated in my mind. Suspicious transfer. Joint liability. The second phrase troubled me most. Joint liability meant shared responsibility, shared accountability. It implied another name, another person. And suddenly I wondered whether that other person was me. The thought sounded ridiculous, yet I couldn't ignore it. The next morning, Richard left before sunrise. Another business trip. Chicago. At least that's what he claimed. As soon as his car disappeared down the street, I sat at the kitchen table and opened my laptop. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. I only knew I needed answers. For years, Richard handled almost every financial account. The arrangement had seemed practical. Now it felt reckless. I began reviewing the documents I could still access. Household records, insurance accounts, property taxes. Nothing unusual appeared at first. Then I noticed something strange. An email notification from a financial institution I didn't recognize. The message was months old, buried beneath hundreds of others. Most people would have ignored it. But the subject line caught my attention. Account update, confirmation. I opened it. The email contained almost no useful information. Just a generic notification. However, one detail stood out. An account number and a company name. Wheeler Strategic Holdings. I frowned. I had never heard of Wheeler Strategic Holdings. Richard's company operated under a completely different corporate name. Maybe it was a subsidiary. Maybe it was nothing. Yet my instincts told me otherwise. I wrote down the information. Then I continued searching. 3 hours later, I had discovered almost nothing. But I had found enough small inconsistencies to keep me concerned. References to accounts I didn't recognize. Notifications that seemed oddly vague. Financial correspondence that no one had ever discussed with me. Each item alone meant very little. Together, they formed a pattern I couldn't yet understand. By afternoon, I needed fresh air. I drove to a nearby cafe and ordered tea. While sitting by the window, I called Megan. My daughter answered on the second ring. "Mom." "Hi." "Sweetheart, you sound serious." I smiled. She always noticed. "Do I?" "Yes." There was a pause. "What's wrong?" For a moment, I considered telling her everything. Instead, I chose my words carefully. "Have you noticed your father acting strange lately?" Megan didn't answer immediately. That alone caught my attention. Finally, she spoke. "What kind of strange, secretive?" Another pause. Longer this time. Then she sighed. "I thought it was just me." My stomach tightened. "Oh, what do you mean?" "The last few times I've talked to him, he seemed distracted. That's all." Mostly. Not entirely." I recognized hesitation when I heard it. But Megan changed the subject before I could ask more questions. After we ended the call, I sat alone for several minutes, thinking something was happening. I didn't know what, but multiple pieces were beginning to point in the same direction. That night, Richard returned home. He seemed exhausted. His smile looked forced. His answers were shorter than usual. And once again, he spent most of the evening guarding his phone. Near midnight, after he finally fell asleep, I quietly left our bedroom. I walked downstairs and sat in the dark living room. The house was silent. I thought about our marriage, about trust, about how many years I had accepted Richard's explanations without question. Then I thought about the phrase from the bank letter, joint liability. A sudden idea came to me. Simple, obvious, something I should have checked sooner. I opened my laptop, logged into a public business registration database, and searched my name. At first, nothing unusual appeared, then a result caught my eye. I clicked. The page loaded. I stared at the screen and felt my heartbeat slow. Not because I was calm, because I was shocked. There it was, in black and white. A business entity registered less than 2 years earlier. My name appeared on the records, not as a shareholder, not as an employee, not as a spouse, as an officer of the company. I blinked. Read it again. Then a third time, the information didn't change. My name remained exactly where it had been. Lori Wheeler, corporate officer. I had never seen this company before. I had never attended a meeting. I had never signed a document. I had never agreed to anything. Yet somehow, officially, legally, my name was attached to a business I knew nothing about. A chill moved through my body. For the first time, I realized this situation wasn't simply about secrecy. It wasn't just about a husband hiding financial information. Something much bigger was happening. And somehow, I was already involved, whether I wanted to be or not. The following Sunday was family dinner night. For years, it had been one of the traditions I worked hardest to preserve. No matter how busy life became, I wanted at least one evening when everyone gathered around the same table. When the children were young, those dinners were filled with laughter. Now they felt more complicated. more fragile, especially after what I had discovered. By late afternoon, I was standing in the kitchen preparing a roast chicken while trying to act normal. The company registration document sat hidden in a folder upstairs. I had printed it twice. Read it at least 20 times. Every time I looked at it, the same question echoed through my mind. How had my name ended up on that company, and why I heard Richard's truck pull into the driveway? A few minutes later, he walked into the kitchen. He kissed my cheek. The gesture felt automatic, routine. Something done out of habit rather than affection. "Smells good," he said. "Thanks." His eyes moved briefly across the room. Watching me. Studying me. For a moment, I wondered whether he sensed something had changed, whether he could tell I knew more than I had a week ago. But if he suspected anything, he didn't show it. Instead, he loosened his tie and opened a bottle of wine. Exactly like every other Sunday. Around 6 o'clock, Ethan arrived. My son was 38 now. Tall like his father. Confident like his father. And lately, unfortunately, more like his father than I cared to admit. He entered carrying a pie from a bakery downtown. "Hey, Mom!" He hugged me. I hugged him back. For a moment, I remembered the little boy who used to follow me around the grocery store holding my hand. Sometimes I missed that version of him. "Dad," Ethan said. Richard smiled. "Good to see you." Within minutes, they were discussing business. As always, on contracts, fuel costs, expansion plans, market trends. The conversation flowed naturally between them. I listened while setting the table. Occasionally, Ethan would ask my opinion about something unrelated. But when money entered the discussion, the attention always shifted back to Richard. By 7 o'clock, we were seated around the dining table. Since Megan lived in Colorado, she joined us through a video call displayed on a tablet beside her empty chair. "Hi, everybody," she said. "Hey, sweetheart," I replied. Seeing her face immediately lifted my mood. Unlike Ethan, she never made me feel invisible. Dinner began pleasantly enough. For the first 15 minutes, everyone discussed ordinary things. Weather, travel plans, a neighbor's retirement party. Then the conversation drifted toward online banking. And everything changed. It started innocently. Ethan mentioned that his company had switched financial software systems. Richard immediately launched into a long explanation. Halfway through, he looked at me and laughed. "You know what's funny?" I felt my stomach tighten. I knew that tone. "What?" "Lori still refuses to use half the banking apps available." Ethan chuckled. "Dad, seriously, it's true?" Richard grinned. "Last year, she asked me how to find a transaction online." The men laughed. I forced a smile. "Megan didn't..." She frowned slightly. "That's not a big deal," she said. Richard waved a dismissive hand. "Maybe not, but finance has never really been Lori's strength." The room grew quieter, not because anyone disagreed, because everyone had heard this story before. Many times, I looked down at my plate. Years ago, comments like that embarrassed me. Now they made me angry. Not explosive anger. Something colder. Something more dangerous. The anger that comes when you realize someone has spent years rewriting your identity. Richard continued talking, apparently unaware that I was no longer listening. He told another story, then another, each one designed to reinforce the same image. Poor Lori, sweet Lori, clueless Lori, the wife who couldn't possibly understand complicated financial matters. Ethan laughed again. Not cruelly, not intentionally. That almost made it worse, because he genuinely believed what his father was saying. I glanced toward the tablet screen. Megan was watching me. Not Richard. Me. Her expression had changed. She looked uncomfortable, concerned, as if she could see something everyone else missed. Then I noticed something else. Ethan. While Richard spoke, my son kept checking his phone, not unusual, except every time finances were mentioned. His attention shifted, his smile faded, his shoulders stiffened. And once, when Richard joked about me being terrible with money, Ethan didn't immediately laugh. Instead, he looked down, just for a second. But I noticed. I've spent my entire life reading people, especially my children. Something was bothering him. After dinner, we moved into the living room for coffee and dessert. The conversation remained light. Mostly, yet I couldn't stop watching Ethan. Every time Richard mentioned business, Ethan seemed uneasy. Every time I asked a question, Ethan became tense. At one point, I casually said, "Your father seems busier than ever lately." The reaction was immediate. Richard answered before Ethan could speak. "Business is growing. Simple, controlled, practiced." Then I looked directly at my son. "Have you been traveling with him much?" Ethan hesitated. Only briefly, but long enough. Sometimes. "Chicago, too." His eyes lifted toward me. For 1 second, surprise flashed across his face. Gone almost immediately, but not before I saw it. Occasionally, Richard took a sip of coffee. Neither man said anything else. The silence felt heavy, meaningful. Megan noticed it too. I could tell. The atmosphere shifted after that. Subtle, yet undeniable. By 9 o'clock, Megan ended the video call. Afterward, Ethan prepared to leave. I walked him to the front door, something I hadn't done in years. Outside, the evening air felt cool. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I asked quietly, "Is everything okay?" His answer came too fast. "Of course," I nodded. "Are you sure?" He forced a smile. "Mom, why wouldn't I be?" "Because you look guilty." The thought remained inside my head. I didn't say it. Instead, I touched his arm. "You know you can talk to me." His smile disappeared briefly, just long enough to reveal genuine discomfort. Then it returned. I know. A minute later, he was gone. I stood in the driveway watching his taillights disappear into the darkness. Something felt wrong. Not just with Richard, with Ethan too. When I returned inside, Richard was cleaning up dessert plates. He looked unusually relaxed, almost pleased with himself. "I think dinner went well," he said. I stared at him. "Did it?" He laughed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing." His eyes narrowed slightly. Then he smiled again. The conversation ended. But later that night, after Richard fell asleep, I sat alone in the living room, thinking, replaying every moment, every expression, every hesitation, every glance. One memory kept returning. The look on Ethan's face when I mentioned Chicago. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't curiosity. It was recognition. As though I had stumbled dangerously close to something he didn't want discussed. For years, I had assumed Ethan simply admired his father. Now I wondered if there was more to it. Maybe Ethan knew something. Maybe he had seen something. Maybe he was protecting someone. I wasn't ready to accuse him of anything, but for the first time, I considered a possibility that broke my heart. What if Richard wasn't the only person keeping secrets from me? What if my son was helping him? The thought stayed with me long after midnight. And deep down, I already feared the answer. 3 days after that family dinner, I found the hidden file. Looking back, I sometimes wonder whether it was luck, or whether, deep down, I had already been searching for it. Richard left for work unusually early that Wednesday morning. The moment his truck disappeared from the driveway, I began cleaning. Not because the house needed it, because I needed something to do with the restless energy building inside me. For days, I had been unable to stop thinking about the company registered under my name. The mystery sat in the back of my mind every waking hour. Every time Richard spoke, every time Ethan avoided a question, every time I saw another unexplained transaction or strange document, something bigger was hiding beneath the surface. I could feel it. The problem was that feelings weren't evidence. I needed facts. That morning, I decided to organize Richard's home office. The room occupied a corner of the first floor overlooking our backyard. Over the years, it had gradually become off-limits. Not officially. Richard never told me to stay out. He simply made it clear that everything inside was business. And according to Richard, business was beyond my understanding. I almost laughed at the irony. The office looked ordinary enough. A large oak desk, several filing cabinets, bookshelves lined with industry reports, awards hanging on the wall, photos from conferences and charity events, the carefully constructed image of a successful businessman. At first, I focused on simple tasks: dusting, organizing shelves, straightening paperwork. Nothing unusual appeared. Then I opened the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet. Inside sat dozens of neatly arranged folders, tax records, insurance paperwork, vehicle registrations. Everything looked perfectly normal. Too normal. Richard had always been organized. But this felt different. Deliberate, curated, as if someone had selected exactly what should be visible. That thought stayed with me. A few minutes later, I noticed something strange. The drawer seemed deeper than it should have been. Years of bookkeeping had taught me to notice details. Measurements, inconsistencies, things that didn't add up. I pulled everything out. Then I examined the cabinet carefully. At first I saw nothing. Then my fingers brushed against a small metal latch hidden beneath the back panel. My pulse quickened. Slowly, I pressed it. A section of the cabinet shifted. A concealed compartment opened. I stared at it. For several seconds. I simply stood there, frozen. Because hidden compartments existed in movies, not in ordinary family homes, not in the office of a respected businessman. Yet there it was. Real. Inside sat a stack of folders. Nothing more. No cash, no jewelry. Just paperwork. The kind of paperwork people hide when they don't want questions. I carried the folders to the desk. My hands were shaking. The first folder contained loan documents. Large loans. Much larger than I expected. Millions of dollars. I frowned. Richard's company was successful, but these amounts seemed unusually high. The second folder contained corporate paperwork, articles of incorporation, operating agreements, ownership structures. I began reading. 5 minutes later, my stomach dropped. The company name was unfamiliar. Bennett Strategic Holdings. I had never heard of it, not once. Not from Richard, not from Ethan, not from anyone. I continued reading. The deeper I went, the worse it became. The company had been formed less than 2 years earlier. Several financial accounts were connected to it. Property leases, business loans, vendor agreements. Everything appeared legitimate until I reached the signature pages. That's when I saw my name. Lori Wheeler. My breath caught. I turned the page, then another, and another. My name appeared repeatedly. Corporate officer, authorized representative, signatory. Every document contained my name. Every document contained my signature. Or what appeared to be my signature. I stared at the pages. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it. At first glance, the signatures looked convincing. Whoever created them had studied my handwriting carefully. The curves were similar. The spacing was similar. The overall appearance was similar. But they weren't mine. I knew every detail of my own signature. These copies contained subtle differences. Tiny mistakes most people would never notice. But I noticed. Because I had signed documents for decades, the signatures were forged. Someone had copied my name, again, and again, and again. I sat down slowly, trying to think, trying to breathe, trying not to panic. A terrible realization began forming. If my signature appeared on these documents, then legally I might be connected to everything the company did. Every loan, every contract, every debt, everything. I forced myself to continue reading. The next folder made the situation even worse. Banking records, account statements, transfer authorizations. Several transactions involved amounts large enough to change lives. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. Some exceeded $1 million. The money moved through accounts I didn't recognize, companies I'd never heard of, entities that seemed to appear and disappear within months. The pattern felt wrong, not merely secretive, wrong, the kind of financial activity that attracts attention, the kind that triggers investigations. Suddenly, the phrase from the bank letter echoed in my head. Suspicious transfer. For the first time, I understood why those words mattered. I kept reading. Then I found something that made my blood run cold. A loan guarantee. The document listed collateral, several business assets, investment accounts, and one additional item: retirement assets associated with Lori Wheeler. I read the sentence twice. Then, a third time, my retirement assets, my retirement money. The savings I had accumulated over decades. The funds intended to support me in old age. The money Richard always claimed was protected. Apparently, it wasn't. Someone had used it without my knowledge, without my permission. I felt physically sick. For years, I had trusted Richard, not blindly, but completely. I trusted him with our finances, our future, our security. And now I was staring at evidence suggesting he had placed my financial well-being at risk. Not accidentally, deliberately. A sound outside made me jump. I quickly checked the clock. Nearly noon. For one terrifying second, I thought Richard had come home. But it was only a delivery truck passing the house. I exhaled, then continued examining the documents. The final folder contained correspondence, emails, letters, internal memos. Most were routine, until one name appeared repeatedly: Claire Bennett. I didn't recognize it, at least not yet, but the name showed up everywhere. Emails, authorizations, corporate discussions, financial planning. Whoever Claire Bennett was, she seemed deeply involved in the company. More involved than anyone else besides Richard. I wrote the name down. Then I carefully returned every document to the hidden compartment, exactly as I found them. No mistakes, no missing pages, no indication anyone had been there. By the time I finished, my hands had stopped shaking, not because I was calm, because shock had evolved into something else. Clarity. The pieces were finally beginning to connect. Richard hadn't simply hidden money. He hadn't merely lied. He had used my identity, my name, my financial future, possibly my legal responsibility. And he had done it while convincing everyone, including our children, that I was too ignorant to understand what was happening. I sat alone in that office for a long time, staring at the desk where my husband had probably signed countless documents, where he had probably planned countless secrets, where he had apparently built an entire hidden financial world. The betrayal cut deeper than I expected. Not because of the money, because of the deception. 34 years. 34 years of marriage. And somehow, I no longer knew the man I slept beside every night. One thing was certain. I could no longer pretend everything was normal. The company registered under my name was real. The forged signatures were real. The loans were real. And if I wanted answers, I needed someone who understood exactly how serious this situation might become. Someone outside my family. Someone I could trust. For the first time, I began thinking about the one person I hadn't spoken to in years. My old friend, Vanessa Brooks. And I had a feeling she was going to tell me things I wasn't prepared to hear. For 2 days, I carried the weight of those documents entirely alone. I cooked dinner. I folded laundry. I smiled through conversations. I sat across from Richard at breakfast and pretended nothing had changed. Meanwhile, a storm was building inside me. Every time I looked at my husband, I saw the forged signatures. Every time he casually discussed finances, I remembered the hidden compartment. Every time he called me sweetheart, I wondered whether he felt even a trace of guilt. What frightened me most wasn't the possibility that Richard had lied. I already knew he had. What frightened me was how much he might have hidden. By Friday morning, I could no longer sit still. I needed answers, real answers, not assumptions, not suspicions. Facts. That meant going directly to the source, the bank. I waited until Richard left for work. Then I gathered the information I had collected: copies of company records, account references, notes from the hidden files. I placed everything into a folder and drove across town. The branch sat inside a modern brick building near a shopping center. I had visited it before, usually with Richard, never alone. As I walked through the doors, I felt strangely nervous. Not because I was afraid, because I knew this visit might change everything. A young employee greeted me. "Good morning. How can I help you today?" I smiled politely. "I need information regarding accounts associated with my name." She nodded and directed me toward a service desk. A few minutes later, another representative joined me. His name tag read Kevin. He appeared friendly enough, professional, patient. The kind of employee trained to reassure nervous customers. "What can I do for you today, Mrs. Wheeler?" I handed him several documents. His expression remained neutral while he reviewed them. Then he looked up. "What specifically are you concerned about?" I chose my words carefully. "I recently discovered my name listed as an officer of a company I don't recognize." His eyebrows rose slightly. "And you believe the registration may be unauthorized?" "I believe I never agreed to it." That answer seemed to get his attention. He examined the documents more closely. For the next several minutes, he asked questions, basic questions at first, then more detailed ones. Eventually, his professional smile faded. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. Finally, he said something unexpected. "Mrs. Wheeler, would you mind waiting a few minutes while I speak with a manager?" My pulse quickened. "Of course." 10 minutes later, a woman in her 50s entered the office. She introduced herself as Sandra. Unlike Kevin, she got straight to the point. "Mrs. Wheeler, I understand you have concerns regarding business accounts connected to your identity." "Yes." She reviewed the documents silently. Then she asked a question nobody else had asked. "Do you have a financial background?" For a second, I almost laughed. The irony felt overwhelming. "Some bookkeeping experience?" Sandra nodded. That single answer changed everything. The conversation immediately became more technical. More direct. More honest. Unlike Richard, she didn't assume I was incapable of understanding financial terminology. And unlike my husband, she wasn't trying to make me feel small. For nearly 40 minutes, we discussed account structures, business registrations, liability issues, and authorization procedures. Sandra couldn't reveal confidential information. Bank regulations prevented that. But she could explain general principles. And what she explained chilled me. "If your name appears as an authorized officer," she said carefully, "then certain financial obligations could potentially be associated with you." Potentially, such an innocent word, yet it carried terrifying implications. What kind of obligations? Loans? Guarantees? Business liabilities? I swallowed hard. And if signatures were forged? Her expression became serious. That would be an entirely different matter. The room felt colder. For the first time, I realized just how vulnerable I might be. This wasn't merely about secrets. This wasn't merely about betrayal. This could affect my legal future, my financial future, everything. Then Sandra said something else, something I wasn't expecting. "Have you reviewed your retirement accounts recently?" My stomach tightened. "No," she nodded slowly. "I would recommend doing so." The warning was subtle, professional, carefully worded, but I heard it clearly. Something wasn't right. Within minutes, she helped me access information related to my personal accounts. Nothing confidential beyond what I was entitled to see. Nothing improper. Just enough to reveal a disturbing truth. Several transactions had occurred that I didn't recognize. At first glance, they seemed legitimate, technical, routine. But once I followed the details, a pattern emerged. Money had moved, not directly withdrawn, not in obvious ways. Instead, portions of my retirement assets had apparently been linked to financial guarantees. My hands began shaking again. I stared at the screen. Years of savings. Years of planning. Years of sacrifice. Connected to obligations I had never approved. "Can this happen accidentally?" I asked quietly. Sandra hesitated. Then she chose her words carefully. "Large financial arrangements usually require documentation." Documentation. The forged signatures immediately came to mind. I felt sick. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Before leaving, Sandra handed me several informational resources. Nothing dramatic, nothing accusatory, but enough to point me toward the next steps. Outside, I sat inside my car for nearly 20 minutes, unable to start the engine, unable to think clearly. The reality was finally becoming impossible to deny. Richard hadn't simply hidden financial information from me. He had used financial structures connected to my identity. He had exposed my retirement assets, possibly without my knowledge, possibly without my consent, and I still didn't know why. That question haunted me throughout the drive home. Why? What could possibly justify this by late afternoon? I found myself parked outside a small coffee shop. I hadn't planned to stop, but suddenly I remembered someone, Vanessa Brooks. The same Vanessa whose name had been circling my thoughts since discovering the hidden files. We had worked together years ago. Before marriage. Before children. Before life pulled us in different directions. Back then, Vanessa had always been the smartest person in any room. Sharp, fearless, impossible to intimidate. Over the years, she had become a financial attorney. We exchanged holiday cards occasionally, nothing more. Yet suddenly I wanted her opinion. Not as a lawyer, as someone I trusted. I searched her name online. Her practice was located less than 30 minutes away. I stared at the screen, then closed my eyes. Part of me still wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation, a misunderstanding, a paperwork error, anything, but deep down, I already knew better. The evidence was piling up. Too many documents, too many inconsistencies, too many lies. That evening, Richard returned home in unusually good spirits. The contrast felt almost surreal. While I sat there wondering whether my retirement savings had been compromised, he chatted casually about work. He even joked during dinner, laughed, smiled, acted like everything was normal. At one point, he asked, "How was your day?" I nearly told him. Nearly looked him in the eye and demanded the truth. Instead, I answered calmly. "Busy?" He nodded, then moved on. No suspicion, no concern, no awareness that I had spent the day uncovering pieces of his hidden world. After dinner, Richard settled into his favorite chair and turned on the television. I sat across from him, watching, studying, trying to understand how a man could maintain such a convincing performance. Eventually, he glanced toward me. "What?" I smiled. "Nothing." But it wasn't nothing, not anymore, because earlier that day, sitting inside a bank office, I had crossed a line I could never uncross. I had stopped being a confused wife looking for reassurance. I had become someone gathering evidence, someone searching for the truth. And for the first time, I knew exactly who I needed to call next. Vanessa Brooks. Because if what I suspected was true, this wasn't just a marital problem. It was something much bigger. And I had a feeling the next answers would be even harder to hear. I didn't call Vanessa Brooks immediately. For nearly a week, I carried her business card in my purse without dialing the number. Part of me still hoped I was overreacting. Part of me wanted to believe there was some explanation that would make everything make sense. After 34 years of marriage, accepting the truth felt almost impossible. Because the truth wasn't just about money. It was about trust. And once trust breaks, every memory changes shape. Every conversation becomes suspicious. Every explanation sounds different. Every smile feels rehearsed. The following Tuesday, I finally called Vanessa. She answered personally, "Lori." The surprise in her voice made me smile despite everything. "It's been a long time. Far too long." We exchanged a few minutes of small talk. Then she heard something in my voice. The warmth faded. What happened? That simple question nearly broke me. Because for days, I had been carrying everything alone. The hidden files, the forged signatures, the loans, the fear, and suddenly someone was asking me directly, not dismissing me. Not talking over me, just listening. "I need help," I said quietly. The silence on the other end lasted only a second. "Come see me." The next afternoon, I drove to her office. Vanessa hadn't changed much. Older, of course, a few gray strands in her dark hair, a few more lines around her eyes. But the same sharp intelligence remained. The same confidence. The same ability to make people tell the truth. For nearly 2 hours, I showed her everything. The business registration. The signatures. The documents from the hidden compartment. The information from the bank. Vanessa didn't interrupt. She simply read. Page after page. Document after document. The deeper she went, the more serious her expression became. Finally, she placed the papers on her desk and folded her hands. Lori, my stomach tightened. What? How much do you know about your husband's business activities? Apparently not enough. Vanessa nodded. I think that's true. The answer wasn't comforting. What does that mean? She looked directly into my eyes. It means I don't think this is just a husband hiding money. A chill moved through me. What do you think it is? Vanessa chose her words carefully. I think someone has been using your identity in ways that could create legal and financial exposure. The room felt very quiet, very small, very cold. I already suspected that. Hearing someone else say it made it real. How bad? I don't know yet. Not yet. Those 2 words echoed in my mind. Vanessa continued reviewing the documents. Then she stopped at a particular page. Who's Claire Bennett? The name instantly caught my attention. I leaned forward. I don't know. You've never heard of her? No. Vanessa slid several papers toward me. Then why does her name appear everywhere? I stared at the documents. She was right. The name appeared repeatedly. Emails, authorizations, contracts. Financial transfers. Claire Bennett. Again and again, almost as frequently as Richard's name. Who was she, and why had Richard never mentioned her? Vanessa noticed my reaction. You should find out. I intend to. As soon as the meeting ended, I began searching. At first, I found very little. The name wasn't uncommon. Thousands of results appeared online. Most were useless. Then I narrowed the search. Location, business connections, corporate records, industry events. Suddenly, the picture became clearer. Claire Bennett was 41 years old. She worked as a business consultant, at least officially. Several articles mentioned her involvement in logistics projects. A few photographs accompanied those articles. The moment I saw her, something twisted inside me. She was attractive, elegant, confident. The kind of woman who looked comfortable in expensive hotels and executive boardrooms. A woman more than 20 years younger than Richard. I tried telling myself that meant nothing. Professional relationships existed. Business partnerships existed. There was no reason to jump to conclusions. But the next discovery made that impossible. I found photographs from industry conferences, fundraisers, networking events. In nearly every image, Claire appeared close to Richard. Too close, standing together, laughing together, traveling together. Not once had Richard mentioned her name. Not once. That omission alone felt suspicious. Then I discovered something else. An apartment, Luxury property records linked Claire to a high-end condominium in downtown Chicago. The address immediately caught my attention. Because Chicago was the city Richard had been visiting repeatedly. The city Ethan reacted strangely to. The city connected to several unexplained business trips. Suddenly, those trips looked very different. I sat at my computer late into the night, examining every piece of information I could find. By midnight, I had built a timeline: business trips, financial transfers, property records, corporate filings. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. The next morning, I made a decision. I would follow the money. People lie. Financial records rarely do. Using information gathered from the hidden files, I began tracing transactions. Not illegally. Only records I could legitimately access. Documents connected to my name. Accounts connected to my retirement assets. Authorized information. What I found made my hands shake. Payments. Large payments. Thousands of dollars moving regularly. Maintenance fees. Property expenses. Luxury purchases. Travel costs. Restaurant charges. High-end retail stores. The spending wasn't random. It centered around one place: Chicago. Again and again, Chicago. Every new transaction felt like another crack spreading through the foundation of my marriage. Then came the worst moment. A charge from an upscale jewelry store. The amount exceeded $12,000. I stared at the figure. $12,000. I couldn't remember the last time Richard bought me flowers. The last time he surprised me. The last time he celebrated our anniversary without checking his phone. Yet somehow he found $12,000 for jewelry. Not for me. For someone else, I already knew it before I confirmed it. But confirmation came anyway. Several days later. Through social media, Claire had attended a charity event. A photograph showed her smiling beside several guests. Around her neck hung an expensive diamond necklace. I compared the image to the transaction details. The timing matched perfectly. I closed the laptop, suddenly unable to look any longer. The betrayal hit differently than I expected. Not explosive, not dramatic. Just heavy. A deep sadness settling inside my chest. 34 years. 34 years together? And while I worried about retirement savings and family dinners, Richard had apparently been building another life. Another relationship. Another version of himself. One that existed beyond my view. That evening, he came home smiling. Talking about a meeting. Talking about growth opportunities. Talking about future plans. I watched him from across the dinner table. And for the first time, I truly saw him. Not the man I married. Not the father of my children. Not the businessman everyone admired. I saw a stranger. A man capable of lying effortlessly. A man capable of using my name. My money. My trust. While pretending everything was normal. Later that night, I called Vanessa. When she answered, I didn't waste time. I know who Claire Bennett is. The silence lasted a moment. Then Vanessa asked quietly, "And?" I looked out the window into the darkness. My voice sounded different than it had a few weeks earlier. Stronger, colder, certain. She's not just a business partner. What makes you think that? I closed my eyes, thinking about the photographs, the apartment, the jewelry, the lies. Because deep down, I already knew, and soon I would have proof. Because Richard isn't just hiding a company, I said. He's hiding an entire life. For almost 2 weeks, I avoided confronting Ethan. Not because I didn't suspect him, because I was afraid of what I might learn. There are some truths a mother never wants to hear. A child lying is painful. A child choosing someone else over you is worse. And a child helping to hide your betrayal. That was something I wasn't sure I could survive. Yet the questions wouldn't leave me alone. Every piece of evidence pointed toward the same conclusion. Ethan knew something. Maybe not everything, but something. The business trips. The company. The strange reactions. The uncomfortable silences. The guilty expressions. Whenever Richard's secrets drifted too close to the surface, Ethan seemed nervous. Not surprised. Not confused. Nervous. The difference mattered. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, I finally called him. "Hey, Mom." His voice sounded normal. Too normal. "Are you busy?" "Not really." "Can we have dinner?" A brief pause. "Sure." I chose a small restaurant halfway between our homes. Neutral territory. Private enough to talk. Public enough to keep emotions under control. At least that was my hope. When Ethan arrived, he looked tired. More tired than usual. The dark circles beneath his eyes suggested he wasn't sleeping well. For a moment, I wondered whether guilt was keeping him awake. Then I hated myself for thinking it. He was still my son. No matter what happened, no matter what I discovered. We ordered coffee and sandwiches. For the first 10 minutes, neither of us mentioned anything important. Weather, work, Megan, the usual subjects people use when avoiding the real conversation. Eventually, I set my coffee cup down. Ethan. His eyes lifted. The moment had arrived. "Yeah, I need you to be honest with me." Immediately, something changed in his expression. A small shift. Barely visible, but enough. "What do you mean?" I held his gaze. "I know about the company." Silence. The restaurant suddenly felt very quiet. Very still. Ethan didn't speak. Didn't move. Didn't even blink. That reaction told me more than any words could have. "You know what company I'm talking about," I said softly. His shoulders sagged. For a few seconds, he looked like a little boy again. Not a successful executive. Not Richard's right-hand man. Just a frightened child. Finally, he spoke. "Mom, The single word sounded exhausted. Defeated. How much do you know?" I almost laughed. Not because anything was funny, because his question answered mine. He knew. He had known all along. "Enough." Ethan looked away, staring out the window, avoiding my eyes, just like he had at family dinner, just like he always did whenever the truth got too close. "When were you planning to tell me?" I asked. His jaw tightened. It wasn't my place. The answer hit me harder than I expected. Not my place. As though protecting his mother wasn't his place. as though watching her be deceived was somehow acceptable.
Not your place.
He rubbed his forehead. Mom, it's complicated. No, my voice remained calm. Surprisingly calm. It's actually very simple. Ethan closed his eyes. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he exhaled. You don't understand. There it was, the phrase, the same phrase Richard used for years. The same dismissal, the same assumption. The irony seemed almost unbearable. I leaned forward. No, Ethan, His eyes met mine. You don't understand. Something in my voice made him stop talking. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, he truly listened. I know about the forged signatures. His face went pale. I know about Bennett's strategic holdings. His hands tightened around his coffee cup. I know about Claire Bennett. Now he looked genuinely shocked. And when I added the final sentence, I watched the last traces of denial disappear.
I know my retirement accounts were used.
The silence that followed felt endless. People at nearby tables continued eating. Servers continued walking through the restaurant. The world kept moving. But inside that booth, everything had changed. Finally, Ethan whispered, "How did you find out?" I stared at him. That question hurt almost as much as the truth. Not because he asked it, because he wasn't denying anything. Not one thing, not the company, not the signatures, not Claire, not the money, nothing. He already knew it was true. My voice came out softer than I expected.
How long have you known?
Ethan lowered his head. A long time passed before he answered.
About a year.
The words struck like a physical blow.
A year. 12 months. 365 days. My son had known for a year. A year of family dinners. A year of phone calls. A year of holidays. A year of watching me sit across from Richard without knowing the truth.
And he had said nothing. I swallowed hard. Why? His eyes filled with regret.
Because unlike Richard, Ethan still had a conscience. I could see it. The guilt had been eating him alive.
He told me it wasn't what it looked like. Who? Dad. Of course, Ethan continued. He said everything was temporary. The excuses sounded familiar. Too familiar. He said the company needed flexibility. I remained silent. He said your name was being used because it made certain transactions easier. The explanation sounded ridiculous. Even Ethan seemed embarrassed repeating it. And you believed him. He looked away. I wanted to. That answer was probably the most honest thing he'd said all evening. He wanted to believe his father. Most children do, even grown children, especially when the alternative is accepting that their hero isn't who they thought. Tears formed in Ethan's eyes. The sight surprised me. I couldn't remember the last time I had seen my son cry. He kept saying he'd fix everything. His voice cracked. He promised nobody would get hurt. I felt my own eyes sting, not because I was ready to forgive him, because I finally understood something. Ethan wasn't protecting the truth. He was protecting the illusion that his father was still a good man, the illusion that the family wasn't broken. The illusion that silence could somehow prevent consequences. But reality doesn't work that way. Eventually, the bill comes due. Always. I took a deep breath, then asked the question I had been avoiding. Did he give you anything? Ethan froze. That reaction alone told me enough. His face drained of color, his eyes filled with shame. I already knew the answer. Still, I needed to hear it. Ethan. He looked down at the table, unable to face me. Finally, he whispered, "Yes." The word shattered something inside me. Not completely, but enough.
How much? His voice barely rose above a whisper. 50,000. I closed my eyes. $50,000. Not a favor. Not gratitude. Not support. A payment. A reward for silence. When I opened my eyes again, Ethan was crying openly. I told myself it was a bonus. The confession poured out now. Unstoppable. I told myself it was compensation. Another tear slid down his face.
I told myself it had nothing to do with you. I listened quietly.
Because there was nothing left to say. Eventually, he looked at me. The little boy was gone. The businessman was gone. Only regret remained. I'm sorry, Mom. The apology sounded genuine. Painfully genuine. And somehow that made everything worse. Because if he had been cruel, forgiveness would have been easier. But Ethan wasn't cruel. He was weak. And weakness can cause just as much damage.
As we left the restaurant, he stopped beside my car. Rain fell softly around us. I never wanted this. I believed him. That didn't change anything. I know. His shoulders shook. What happens now? I looked at my son. Really looked at him. For the first time in weeks, I felt completely certain of something. The secrets were bigger than I originally thought. The betrayal ran deeper. And Richard had involved more people than I imagined. But now, I finally had confirmation. My husband hadn't acted alone. And my son had just admitted it. Which meant the next steps would be impossible to avoid. Because this was no longer suspicion. It was evidence. And Richard Wheeler's carefully constructed world was beginning to crack. The morning after my conversation with Ethan, I stopped hoping for innocent explanations. That chapter was over. For weeks, I had been searching for reasons to doubt my own instincts. Maybe Richard wasn't involved. Maybe the signatures were a mistake. Maybe the company had a legitimate purpose. Maybe Ethan misunderstood. Maybe Claire was only a business associate. One by one, those possibilities had collapsed. Now I was left with facts. Cold. Uncomfortable. Undeniable facts. Richard had hidden a company. My name appeared on legal documents. My signature had been forged. My retirement assets had been exposed to financial obligations. A younger woman was deeply involved. And my son had admitted he knew about it. The truth wasn't fully visible yet, but the outline was becoming clear. And if I wanted to protect myself, I needed more than suspicions. I needed evidence. That afternoon, I returned to Vanessa Brooks's office. She greeted me with a serious expression. The moment she saw my face, she knew something had happened. Ethan talked. I nodded. Vanessa leaned back in her chair. What did he say? For nearly 30 minutes, I repeated everything. The confession, the payment, the year of silence, the excuses Richard had given. Vanessa listened carefully. When I finished, she remained quiet for several moments. Finally, she spoke. Lori, we're beyond family secrets now. My stomach tightened. What do you mean? I mean, this is beginning to look like something much more serious. The words hung in the air. Much more serious. I already suspected that. Still, hearing it from a lawyer carried different weight. Vanessa opened a notebook. Then she began making a list. Let's organize what we know. For the next hour, we built a timeline. Every trip, every document, every transfer, every suspicious event. The process felt strangely empowering. For weeks, the information had existed as scattered fragments inside my head. Now it became something structured, something tangible, something real. By the time we finished, several pages were covered with notes. Vanessa reviewed them carefully. Then she circled several items. These concern me most. I looked down. The forged signatures, the company registration, the retirement account connections, the unexplained transfers. Why these? Because they potentially involve legal exposure. The room suddenly felt colder. Vanessa continued. If your identity was used without authorization, that's significant. I nodded. If financial guarantees were executed using forged signatures, that's significant. Another nod. And if money moved through entities connected to false representations? She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The implication was obvious. I stared at the notes. For the first time, I began to understand the scale of what might be happening. This wasn't merely about infidelity. It wasn't merely about dishonesty. Entire financial structures appeared to be built on deception. Vanessa turned another page. We need documentation. More than we already have. Much more. She wasn't wrong. Evidence wins arguments. Evidence survives courtrooms. Evidence matters. Feelings don't. The next phase began immediately. Over the following several weeks, I lived 2 separate lives. At home, I remained Lori Wheeler, the quiet wife, the woman Richard underestimated, the woman everyone assumed knew nothing about money. I cooked dinner, attended social events, answered phone calls, smiled when expected, played my role perfectly. Behind the scenes, everything was different. Every evening, after Richard went to sleep, I worked. Documents, records, statements, emails, corporate filings, public databases, every piece of information I could legally obtain, every detail that might help explain what was really happening. The deeper I dug, the stranger the picture became. Certain transactions moved money between companies that appeared unrelated. Yet the same names appeared repeatedly, the same addresses, the same officers, the same financial patterns. At one point, Vanessa spread several documents across her conference table. Look at this. I leaned forward. What am I seeing? Connections. She pointed to several corporate records. Different companies, different names, different industries. Yet somehow they all linked back to a small circle of individuals. One name appeared repeatedly. Richard Wheeler. Another appeared almost as often. Claire Bennett. The sight made my stomach turn. The two names seemed woven together. Business relationships. Financial relationships. Corporate relationships. Far more extensive than I had imagined. Vanessa pointed to another section. This concerns me. What is it? She handed me several transfer records. The amounts were substantial. Some exceeded hundreds of thousands of dollars. What am I looking at? Movement? I frowned. Movement of what? Money. Her answer sounded obvious. Yet the expression on her face suggested something deeper. These transactions don't make much sense. My pulse quickened. What does that mean? It means someone may have been moving assets around very aggressively. I looked down at the records. The numbers blurred together. Large sums flowing between entities, accounts, organizations, transactions that seemed unnecessarily complicated, at least to me. Vanessa sighed. Lori, I can't draw conclusions yet. The phrase yet caught my attention. Not yet. Again, that word seemed to follow us everywhere. But she hesitated, then answered honestly. But if investigators ever examined this activity, they would probably have questions. Questions. That sounded far too mild. I suspected the reality would be much harsher. The evidence continued growing. Every week revealed something new. A document, a transfer, a corporate filing, a contradiction. Slowly, a mountain formed. One evening, I sat alone at my kitchen table reviewing records. The house was silent. Richard was away again. Chicago. Of course. By then, I no longer believed his explanations. The destination alone made my stomach tighten. As I studied another stack of paperwork, my phone buzzed. It was Megan. I answered immediately. Hi, sweetheart. Her voice sounded concerned. Mom, are you okay? The question surprised me. Why wouldn't I be? Because Ethan called me. My grip tightened on the phone. What did he say? He sounded awful. I closed my eyes. Of course he did. The guilt was consuming him. He told me you've been asking questions. Not everything, just enough. Typical Ethan, still protecting everyone. Even now, Megan continued. Mom! What's happening? I looked around the empty kitchen. For a moment, I considered telling her everything. Then I remembered how much the truth would hurt. I'm working through some things. The answer wasn't a lie, just incomplete. She sighed. Whatever it is, I'm on your side. The words hit me harder than expected. Because lately, I had felt very alone. Vanessa was helping. But Megan's support felt different. Personal. Unconditional. After we ended the call. I sat quietly for several minutes. Thinking. Reflecting. Gathering strength. Then I returned to work. Because every day brought me closer to understanding the truth. And every day made one thing increasingly clear. Richard believed he was still in control. He believed his secrets remained hidden. He believed the version of me he created years ago still existed.
The harmless wife. The uninformed wife. The wife who would never challenge him. That assumption was becoming his greatest mistake. Toward the end of that month, Vanessa called unexpectedly. Her tone immediately caught my attention. What happened? I found something. My heart began racing. What? She paused, long enough to make me nervous. Then she spoke. Lori, if these records are accurate, some of the activity we're seeing could attract attention far beyond a divorce attorney. I sat perfectly still. What kind of attention? Another pause. Then the answer. The kind that banks take very seriously. The kind that regulators take seriously. The kind that can trigger investigations. The kind that can freeze accounts. For a moment, neither of us spoke, because we both understood what that meant. The evidence was no longer pointing toward a marital dispute. It was pointing toward something much bigger. And for the first time, I realized Richard's entire financial empire might be standing on much weaker ground than anyone imagined. 3 weeks after Vanessa's warning, Richard invited me to a charity gala. Under normal circumstances, I would have declined. By then, every public appearance felt exhausting. Every smile felt fake. Every conversation felt like theater. But this invitation was different. The event was one of the largest charity fundraisers in our region. Business owners, politicians, investors, community leaders, everyone would be there, including people connected to Richard's professional world, including, I suspected, Claire Bennett, so I accepted, not because I wanted an evening out, because I wanted to observe. The gala took place at a luxury hotel in downtown Columbus. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and polished marble. Women wore designer gowns. Men wore expensive suits. Waiters carried trays of champagne. The room looked beautiful. I felt sick. Richard, however, seemed energized, confident, comfortable, as if he belonged in exactly this environment. Maybe he did. For years, he had carefully built that image. The successful businessman, the generous philanthropist, the respected community leader, the man everyone admired. No one in that ballroom knew about the hidden company. No one knew about the forged signatures. No one knew about my retirement assets. No one knew about Claire, at least not publicly. As we entered the room, dozens of people greeted Richard. Hands were shaken. Business cards exchanged. Stories shared. The performance began immediately, and Richard was very good at it. I walked beside him, smiling politely whenever necessary. For a while, nothing unusual happened. Then dinner began. We were seated at a large table with several local business owners and their spouses. The conversation flowed easily. Economic forecasts, real estate, travel, investments. The same topics that always seemed to dominate these gatherings. Eventually, someone asked Richard about recent market conditions. That was all the invitation he needed. Within seconds, he was delivering one of his usual speeches, confident, polished, self-assured. The table listened attentively. A few people even took notes. Then someone turned toward me. Lori, what do you think? The question surprised me. Before I could answer, Richard laughed. The sound immediately transported me back 20 years, back to every dinner party, Every gathering, every joke. Oh, don't ask Laurie. Several guests chuckled politely. Richard smiled. Money and finance have never really been her thing. The table laughed. Not maliciously. Just enough. Just the way people always did. I felt heat rise in my chest. Not embarrassment. Not anymore. Anger. For decades, I had tolerated comments like that. Excused them. Ignored them. Minimized them. But now I knew what those jokes truly accomplished. They weren't harmless. They were strategic. Every joke reinforced the same narrative. Richard understands money. Laurie doesn't. Richard is the expert. Laurie is the bystander. That narrative had protected him for years. Because people rarely question a man when they've already decided his wife is clueless. I looked around the table, watching everyone smile, watching everyone accept the story, and for the first time, I felt something unexpected. Pity, not for myself, for them. Because they had no idea who Richard really was. Dinner continued. Richard moved from topic to topic effortlessly. Meanwhile, I remained quiet, observing, waiting. Then I saw her, Claire Bennett. She entered through the ballroom doors shortly after the main course was served. Even from across the room, I recognized her immediately. The photographs hadn't done her justice. She was elegant, confident, beautiful. The kind of woman who attracted attention simply by entering a room. Several people greeted her. Others turned to look. But my attention wasn't on Claire. It was on Richard. The moment he noticed her, something changed, only slightly. Most people wouldn't have seen it. I did. His posture straightened. His eyes lingered a fraction too long. His expression softened. For just a moment, then he quickly looked away. Too quickly. A man with nothing to hide would have behaved naturally. Richard behaved carefully. That difference mattered. I continued watching. 20 minutes later, Claire approached our table. My pulse quickened. This was the first time I would see them interact in person. A local investor introduced her. Several guests welcomed her warmly. Then she turned toward Richard. Their greeting lasted only seconds. Professional, polite, appropriate, almost, because once again, the details betrayed them. The familiarity, the comfort, the tiny smile neither could fully suppress. Most people saw colleagues. I saw something else. Then Claire turned toward me. You must be Laurie. Her voice was warm, friendly, practiced. I smiled. And you must be Claire. For one brief second, something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, awareness, perhaps even concern, gone almost immediately. We exchanged pleasantries. Nothing more. Yet the encounter left me unsettled. Not because of what was said, because of what wasn't. The entire conversation felt rehearsed, as though everyone involved understood a script except me. A little later, Claire moved to another table, but I continued observing. Throughout the evening, she and Richard never spent much time together. In fact, they seemed careful not to. Too careful. Avoiding attention often creates more suspicion than attracting it. Around 9 o'clock, the charity auction began. Guests mingled while items were displayed throughout the ballroom. That was when I noticed something. Claire stood near one of the display areas, speaking with several donors. As she turned, light reflected off her neck. The diamond necklace. My stomach dropped because I recognized it instantly, not the necklace itself. The transaction, months earlier, I had reviewed a jewelry purchase connected to one of the financial records. The amount had been unforgettable. Over $12,000. At the time, I had only suspected. Now I was looking directly at the result. The design matched the description perfectly. The timing matched. Everything matched. For several seconds, I couldn't breathe. The room seemed to fade away. All I could see was that necklace. Proof. Physical proof. A visible reminder that Richard's secret life wasn't theoretical. It was real. Painfully real. The betrayal hit differently than discovering documents. Documents are numbers. Paper. Evidence. A diamond necklace around another woman's neck feels personal. Human. Intimate. I excused myself and walked toward a quiet hallway outside the ballroom. For a few minutes, I simply stood there, trying to regain control, trying not to cry, trying not to collapse under the weight of everything I had learned. 34 years. 34 years of loyalty, of sacrifice, of trust, and somewhere along the way, Richard had decided that none of it mattered. A familiar voice interrupted my thoughts. Lori, I turned. Vanessa Brooks stood at the end of the hallway. I had forgotten she was attending the gala the moment she saw my face. She understood. You saw her. It wasn't a question. I nodded. And the necklace, again, not a question. Another nod. Vanessa walked closer. Are you okay? I laughed softly. The sound surprised even me. No? At least it was honest. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then Vanessa said something important. Something I needed to hear. Don't lose focus. I looked at her. The affair hurts. She paused. But the financial evidence matters more. She was right. Pain could cloud judgment. Anger could create mistakes. And Richard was still unaware of how much I knew. That advantage mattered. I took a deep breath, then another. Slowly, my composure returned. When I finally walked back into the ballroom, Richard was laughing with a group of investors, looking confident, looking successful, looking untouchable. He smiled when he saw me, the same smile he had worn for years, the same smile that once made me feel safe. Now it looked different. Because I finally understood something, Richard believed he was managing multiple lives successfully. His wife, his business, his affair, his secrets. What he didn't realize was that those worlds were beginning to collide. And when they finally did, the damage would be impossible to contain. The call came on a Tuesday morning, at exactly 7:12 a.m., the same moment I had described in the opening of this story. The moment everything changed. The moment Richard Wheeler's carefully constructed world began to collapse. I remember the details with perfect clarity. The sunlight spilling across the kitchen floor,
The smell of coffee brewing. The sound of the refrigerator humming softly in the background. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary moments. Nothing about that morning felt extraordinary. Until Richard's phone rang. He glanced at the screen. Immediately frowned. Then answered. At first, he sounded annoyed. Not worried. Not frightened. Just irritated. The way successful businessmen often sound when interrupted. Richard Wheeler, a pause, then another. His expression changed. Subtly, at first. Then dramatically, he straightened in his chair. What do you mean? The person on the other end continued speaking. I watched quietly. Years of marriage had taught me how to read him. And for the first time in decades, I saw genuine fear, not stress, not frustration. Fear. His hand tightened around the phone. The color drained from his face. That's impossible. Another pause, then louder. What do you mean, frozen? The words echoed through the kitchen. Frozen. I remained perfectly still. The person continued talking. Richard listened, interrupting occasionally. Each interruption sounded more desperate than the last. No. Pause. There has to be a mistake. Pause. You can't do that. Longer pause. Then silence. The call ended. Richard stared at his phone, motionless, like a man struggling to understand what had just happened. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the obvious question. What's wrong? He looked at me, but I could tell he barely saw me. His mind was somewhere else. The bank. His voice sounded strange, unsteady. What about the bank? They froze the accounts. I tilted my head slightly. Which accounts? All of them. The words came out almost as a whisper. I knew exactly how serious that was. Businesses can survive many problems. Frozen accounts are not one of them. Without access to funds, everything stops. Payroll, operations, credit obligations, vendor payments, investments, everything. Richard immediately began dialing another number. No answer. He tried again. Still nothing. Then another number, and another. Each call increased his panic. Each failed attempt deepened his fear. I sat quietly at the kitchen table, watching. Observing. For years, Richard had controlled every financial decision in our household. For years, he had treated money as his private kingdom. For years, he had insisted that I didn't understand these things. Now, he looked like a man drowning. And for the first time, I wasn't the one asking questions. He was. By 8 o'clock, the situation had become worse. Much worse. Several calls arrived in rapid succession. One from a lender, another from a business partner. Another from someone in accounting. Every conversation followed the same pattern. Confusion, concern, urgency. Richard moved through the house like a storm. Phone pressed against his ear. Voice growing louder. Temper growing shorter. At one point, he slammed a door so hard the walls shook. I had never seen him like this. Not once in 34 years. Even during economic downturns. Even during lawsuits. Even during family emergencies, Richard always projected control. That morning, control was gone. Around 9 o'clock, he finally ended a call and sat heavily at the kitchen table. For several moments, he simply stared into space. Then he looked at me, really looked at me. Perhaps for the first time in months. "Lori," I waited. "I need your help." The irony almost took my breath away. Not because I enjoyed it, because it felt surreal. For years, I had supposedly known nothing about money. Now suddenly my help mattered. "What kind of help?" Richard rubbed both hands across his face. "I'm trying to figure out what's happening." The answer sounded absurd. Because I already knew more about his financial situation than he realized, I simply nodded. "What did the bank say?" His eyes shifted away. That alone told me something. Richard was still hiding information. Even now, they're reviewing certain transactions. Certain transactions. Interesting choice of words. Why? I don't know. A lie. Not a complete lie. But still a lie. I could hear it. After so many years together, I knew exactly when Richard was withholding information. His phone rang again. He answered immediately. The conversation lasted less than a minute. When it ended, he looked even worse. "What happened?" He swallowed hard. A line of credit was suspended. My pulse remained steady. Outwardly. Inside, I understood the significance. Credit lines don't disappear without reason. Something serious was happening. Very serious. Throughout the day, the calls continued. Employees, attorneys, lenders, business contacts. The pressure mounted relentlessly. Meanwhile, I remained calm, not because I lacked emotions, because I had spent months preparing for this possibility. Richard was experiencing the shock all at once. I had experienced it gradually, document by document, lie by lie, discovery by discovery. The emotional damage had already happened. Now, I was simply watching consequences unfold. By afternoon, Ethan arrived. His expression suggested he already knew something was wrong. The moment he entered the house, Richard pulled him aside. They disappeared into the study. The same study where I had discovered the hidden compartment. The same study where everything began. An hour later, Ethan emerged looking pale. His eyes met mine briefly, then dropped. Guilt, fear, regret. All three emotions were written across his face. Richard followed him into the kitchen. His confidence seemed to have disappeared completely. "What are people saying?" he asked Ethan. My son hesitated. Nobody knows much yet. Yet, another important word. Yet implied more information was coming. More discoveries. More consequences. The day continued spiraling. By evening, even Richard seemed exhausted. His tie hung loose around his neck. His hair was disheveled. Dark circles had formed beneath his eyes. The transformation was astonishing. 24 hours earlier, he had looked untouchable. Now he looked vulnerable, human, scared. At dinner, almost no one ate. The atmosphere felt heavy, oppressive.
like waiting for a storm to arrive. Eventually, Richard set down his fork, then turned toward me. "I don't understand how this happened." The statement hung in the air. I looked at him quietly. There was a time when those words might have inspired sympathy, concern, compassion. But sympathy requires trust, and trust no longer existed. So instead, I asked a simple question. "Are you sure you don't understand?" His eyes immediately locked onto mine. The room became silent. Ethan stopped eating. Even he sensed something shifting. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Richard looked away. That reaction told me everything. He knew. Maybe not every detail, maybe not every consequence, but he knew why the bank was concerned. He knew why accounts were being reviewed. He knew why institutions were asking questions. The lies had finally become too large to manage. The structure was beginning to crack. And for the first time, Richard seemed to realize that later that night, after everyone had gone home, I sat alone in the living room, thinking, reflecting, waiting. My phone vibrated. A message from Vanessa. Only a few words, but enough. "The review has expanded." I stared at the screen. My heart remained calm. Steady, certain. Months earlier, that message would have terrified me. Now it felt different. Because I finally understood something. Richard believed this crisis had appeared suddenly. He thought the bank's actions came out of nowhere. He thought he had been blindsided. But the truth was much simpler. Consequences rarely arrive without warning. They arrive after months, sometimes years, of decisions. And Richard Wheeler had spent years making dangerous decisions. The bill had finally arrived. The only thing he still didn't know was this: the person who had helped expose the truth was sitting under the same roof. And soon, he was going to find out. Richard confronted me 3 days later. Not because he suddenly became honest, because desperation had finally made him careless. The pressure surrounding him was growing by the hour. Banks were asking questions. Attorneys were making calls. Business partners were becoming nervous. Credit facilities remained restricted. Several ongoing transactions had been delayed. For a man who spent his entire life controlling every situation, the loss of control was devastating. And like many people who are losing control, Richard needed someone to blame. That someone was me. The confrontation began shortly after 8 o'clock on a Friday evening. I was sitting in the living room reviewing paperwork when Richard entered. He didn't say hello. He didn't sit down. He simply stood in the doorway staring at me. Something in his expression immediately caught my attention. Anger. Real anger. Not frustration. Not irritation. Anger. The kind that comes from fear. I slowly closed the folder in my lap. "What is it?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked farther into the room. Each step seemed deliberate, calculated. Almost threatening, finally he spoke. "Have you been talking to people?" The question wasn't surprising. In truth, I had expected this moment. Still, hearing it aloud felt strangely surreal. What people? His jaw tightened. Don't play games. I remained calm. I asked a question. Richard laughed bitterly. The sound held no humor. No. Laurie. His eyes narrowed. I asked the question. For a few seconds, silence settled between us. Then I looked directly at him. Yes. The single word seemed to catch him off guard. He blinked. Apparently, he expected denial, excuses, deflection. Instead, I gave him honesty, something he hadn't given me in years. Yes, I repeated. I've been talking to people. The color drained from his face. Not because of the admission itself, because of what it confirmed. He already suspected. Now he knew. His voice dropped lower. Who? I considered lying, then decided against it. Vanessa Brooks. The reaction was immediate, a flicker of panic, gone almost instantly. But not fast enough. I saw it, and once again, his expression told me more than his words ever could. What have you told her? Enough. The answer infuriated him. I could see it. What does that mean? It means exactly what I said. For years, Richard had controlled conversations by making me uncomfortable, interrupting, dismissing, redirecting. Tonight, those tactics weren't working. That realization seemed to make him even angrier. His voice rose. You have no idea what you're doing. I stared at him. Then something unexpected happened. I laughed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. The sound stopped him cold, because I had never laughed at Richard before. Not like that. Not when he was angry. Not when he was trying to intimidate me. What? His voice sounded stunned. I shook my head. It's incredible. What is... The fact that you still think I'm the one who doesn't understand what's happening? For several seconds, he simply stared at me. Then his expression hardened. What exactly do you think you know? There it was. The challenge. The invitation. The moment we had both been approaching for months. I slowly opened the folder beside me, then removed a stack of documents. The first page landed on the coffee table. A corporate registration. Bennett Strategic Holdings. Richard's eyes immediately dropped toward it. The muscles in his jaw tightened. I placed a second document beside it, then a third, then a fourth. Loan agreements, transfer records, corporate filings. The room remained silent. I wasn't finished. Next came copies of the forged signatures. My signatures. Or rather, the versions someone wanted the world to believe were mine. Richard's face grew paler with each page. What is this? The question sounded absurd. He knew exactly what it was. I answered anyway. Evidence. For the first time since entering the room, he looked uncertain. Not angry. Uncertain. The difference mattered. I continued. I know about the company. Silence. I know about the forged signatures. Silence. I know about the retirement account guarantees. Silence. I know about Claire Bennett. That finally triggered a reaction. A visible one. His eyes widened slightly. His shoulders stiffened. For months, Claire had existed as a secret. Now she didn't. The secret was gone, and Richard knew it. The room felt very small, very quiet, very tense. Then something inside him snapped. His uncertainty transformed into rage. "You don't understand any of this." There was that phrase again. The phrase he had hidden behind for decades. The phrase that had allowed him to dismiss me, control me, belittle me. Not anymore. I leaned forward. "Then explain it." His mouth opened, then closed. No explanation came, because there wasn't one, at least not a good one. I waited. Richard looked away. That silence was louder than any confession. Finally, he spoke. "It's complicated." I nodded slowly. "That's not an explanation. It's business. Again, always business. Always another excuse. Always another shield." I picked up one of the documents. "A forged signature isn't business." His eyes flashed. "A retirement account guarantee isn't business." His breathing grew heavier. "An affair isn't business." That word hit him hardest. Affair, no euphemisms, no polite language, just truth, raw and unavoidable. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then Richard slammed his hand onto the table. The sound echoed through the room. "You think you know everything?" His voice thundered through the house. I remained seated, calm, steady, because something important had happened. The fear was gone. Months ago, this confrontation would have terrified me. Now, it didn't. Because the truth had given me something Richard could no longer take away. Confidence. He continued pacing, talking faster, louder, more emotionally. The controlled businessman had vanished. What remained was a frightened man watching his world unravel. Then he said something revealing. Something I don't think he intended to say. If this gets out, everyone gets hurt. Everyone. Interesting choice of words. Not me, not him, everyone. Meaning there were others involved, others at risk, others connected to the secrets. I noticed the mistake immediately. "So, there is something to get out." Richard froze. The realization crossed his face instantly. He knew he had said too much. For the first time all evening, I saw genuine panic, not financial panic. Personal panic. The panic of a man who realizes the truth is escaping. He lowered his voice. "You need to stop." The sentence sounded almost desperate. "Stop what?" "Talking." There it was. The real request. Not understanding, not forgiveness. Silence. He wanted silence. The same silence he had relied on for years. The same silence Ethan had protected. The same silence that allowed everything to continue. I looked directly into his eyes. No. The answer landed like a hammer. Richard stared at me, disbelief written across his face. Because I had spent decades saying yes. Yes to compromises. Yes to explanations. Yes to patience. Tonight was different. The silence stretched between us. Eventually, he spoke again, this time more quietly. Almost threatening. You don't realize what you're starting. I considered that carefully, then answered honestly. No, Richard. I stood. For the first time, we faced each other as equals, eye to eye. No, I shook my head. I'm not starting this. His face hardened. You did. The words hung in the air. Heavy. Final. True. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then Richard turned away. Without another word, he left the room. A few moments later, I heard his office door slam shut. The house fell silent. I stood alone in the living room, breathing slowly, steadily. Then I reached into my pocket, removed my phone, and stopped the recording. The screen displayed nearly 40 minutes of audio. Every admission, every threat, every contradiction, every mistake, recorded, preserved. Protected. Earlier that week, Vanessa suggested documenting any confrontation, just in case. Now I understood why. As I listened briefly to the saved file, one thing became clear. Richard still believed he could control the outcome. What he didn't realize was that every attempt to regain control was creating more evidence, and the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. The months that followed were the hardest of my life, not because I doubted myself. That stage was over. The truth had become too clear, the evidence too overwhelming, the lies too numerous. No. The difficult part was watching the consequences spread through people I loved. Because when a family secret explodes, it never hurts only the person who created it. Everyone gets caught in the blast. By early spring, attorneys were heavily involved. What began as private concerns had evolved into formal investigations, financial reviews, and legal proceedings. Vanessa remained by my side throughout all of it. Steady, focused, unwavering. Every week brought another meeting, another document request, another discovery. And every discovery seemed to reveal a little more of the truth. Richard's business empire wasn't entirely fraudulent. That would have been simpler. The reality was messier. Much of the company was legitimate. Many employees were honest people doing honest work. Many clients had no idea anything was wrong. That complexity made everything harder. Because people often imagine wrongdoing as something obvious, in reality, it frequently hides inside otherwise normal lives. Richard hadn't built a fake business. He had built a real one. Then he made a series of increasingly dangerous decisions. Decisions that eventually became impossible to hide. As financial records were reviewed, several troubling patterns emerged. The unauthorized use of my identity, the forged signatures, the guarantees connected to retirement assets, the hidden company structures, the transfers involving Claire Bennett. The picture wasn't pretty, neither was the publicity. News travels quickly in business circles. Rumors travel even faster. People who once praised Richard now whispered about him. People who once admired him now questioned him. Some disappeared entirely. Others publicly distanced themselves.
I watched all of it unfold with mixed emotions. Part of me felt vindicated. Another part felt deeply sad. Because despite everything, Richard had once been the man I loved. The father of my children. The person I trusted most. Watching someone fall is painful, even when they deserve it. Especially when they deserve it. The family suffered too. Ethan suffered the most. The guilt that had haunted him for months became impossible to hide. One afternoon, he asked to meet me. We sat together in a small park near my house. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, he broke the silence. I should have told you. His voice sounded exhausted. I looked at him carefully, for the first time in a long while. I saw honesty. Not excuses, not explanations, just honesty. I know. He stared down at the ground. I kept telling myself Dad would fix it. The familiar justification. The same one he had repeated before. This time, it sounded different. Less defensive. More ashamed. I wanted to believe him. I nodded. I know that too. Tears filled his eyes. I failed you. The words hit me harder than expected. Because they were true. And because he finally understood that. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then I reached across and touched his hand. Not because everything was forgiven, not because the damage had disappeared. Because healing sometimes begins with acknowledging reality. Nothing more, nothing less. Across the country, Megan reacted differently. Unlike Ethan, she had never participated in the deception. The moment she learned the full truth, she became fiercely protective. Of me, of the facts, of accountability. She called constantly, visited whenever possible, supported every difficult decision. One evening during a video call, she said something I never forgot. Mom, you spent your whole life protecting everyone else. I smiled. Maybe? No, her voice was firm. You did. Then she leaned closer to the screen. It's okay to protect yourself now? The words stayed with me. Because for most of my life, protecting myself felt selfish. Now I was learning otherwise. Meanwhile, another issue emerged. The house. The beautiful home where Richard and I had raised our children. The home where birthdays were celebrated. Christmas mornings unfolded. Family traditions were created. The home filled with memories. Unfortunately, it was also a significant asset. And assets attract attention during legal disputes. One afternoon, Vanessa called me into her office. Her expression suggested important news. What happened? She handed me a folder. Property records. My pulse quickened. The house had worried me for months, not because of its value, because of what it represented. I opened the folder. Several documents appeared inside. Some old. Some very old. Vanessa waited quietly while I reviewed them. Then something caught my attention. A date, an amount, a source of funds. I frowned. What is this? Vanessa smiled slightly.
The answer to a very important question. I continued reading, slowly, carefully. Then realization struck. The original down payment on our home came from an inheritance. My inheritance. Money left by my parents years earlier. I remembered the inheritance, of course, but I hadn't thought about it in decades. At the time, Richard handled the paperwork. I trusted him. The memory faded. Now it returned with startling clarity. Vanessa pointed towards several supporting documents. Bank records, transfer records, closing records. Everything matched. Everything aligned. Everything proved the same thing. The foundation of that home's ownership traced directly back to my inheritance. Not Richard's, mine. A strange mix of relief and sadness washed over me. Relief because the documentation was clear. Sadness because I realized how little attention I had paid to my own financial life for so many years. The lesson felt painful, but necessary. The legal process continued. Investigators asked questions. Attorneys exchanged documents. Business relationships deteriorated. And eventually, the truth became impossible to ignore. Even Ethan finally stopped defending his father. The turning point came during a formal proceeding when he was asked direct questions. For years, he protected Richard. That day, he chose honesty. The decision visibly broke him. Yet it also seemed to free him. Afterward, he called me. I told the truth. I closed my eyes. A long silence followed. Then I answered, "I'm proud of you. Not because he had been perfect, because he had finally chosen integrity. Sometimes that's the harder path." As summer approached, Richard looked older. Much older. Stress had changed him. The confident businessman I once knew seemed to disappear. In his place stood a tired man surrounded by consequences. We rarely spoke. When we did, conversations remained brief, civil, distant. The marriage, at least emotionally, was already over. One evening, Vanessa and I reviewed the latest documents together. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. When it ended, she closed the final folder and smiled. Not triumphantly, simply with satisfaction. The facts are clear. I exhaled slowly. Months of fear seemed to leave my body all at once. Not everything was finished. Far from it. But something important had changed. For the first time since discovering that hidden compartment, I felt safe. Not because the battle was over, because the truth had survived scrutiny. Every document, every record, every fact, the truth remained standing. And so did I. As I walked out of Vanessa's office that evening, sunlight stretched across the parking lot. Warm, golden, peaceful. For months, I had been fighting to uncover reality. Now reality was finally visible. And despite all the pain, one thing had become undeniably clear. Richard Wheeler had built his life on the assumption that nobody would ever look closely. Especially not me. That assumption had cost him everything. By the time autumn arrived, the storm had largely passed. The investigations were no longer headline news. The endless meetings had slowed.
The legal uncertainty that once dominated every day had finally begun to fade. For the first time in more than a year, I could breathe without feeling a weight on my chest. But peace has a strange way of arriving. It rarely looks the way you expect. For most of that year, I imagined that justice would feel like victory, like celebration, like standing on a mountain after surviving a difficult climb. Instead, it felt quiet, almost lonely. Because while the truth had protected me, it had also changed everything. The family I once knew no longer existed. The marriage certainly didn't. And Richard Wheeler, the man who had dominated so much of my life, was now little more than a shadow of himself. The first major change came from Claire Bennett. For years, she had benefited from Richard's attention, resources, and influence. For years, she had existed inside the hidden world he built. But hidden worlds tend to collapse quickly when money disappears. One afternoon, I received an unexpected call from a mutual acquaintance. We spoke briefly. Then she casually mentioned something interesting. Claire moved out. I remained silent. The woman continued. Apparently, she left months ago. The information didn't surprise me. Not really. Relationships built on deception rarely survive accountability. Once Richard's financial problems became public, the foundation beneath everything shifted. Power changed. Influence changed. Money changed. And Claire, it seemed, had chosen self-preservation. Later, I learned she had relocated to another state. The details no longer mattered. For months, I thought confronting Claire would bring closure. Instead, I discovered something unexpected. I didn't care anymore. That realization felt liberating. Because indifference is often more powerful than anger. Meanwhile, Richard's situation continued deteriorating. Several business relationships ended permanently. Investors disappeared. Former friends stopped calling. People who once competed for his attention suddenly became unavailable. I witnessed it from a distance, not with satisfaction, not exactly, just observation. One evening, I saw him sitting alone on the back patio, the same patio where we once hosted family barbecues, the same patio where our children played when they were young. For several minutes, I watched through the kitchen window. He looked older than his years, smaller somehow, as though life had slowly removed the armor he spent decades wearing. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Then I remembered the forged signatures, the hidden company, the lies, the manipulation, the years spent convincing everyone that I was incapable. Compassion remained. Trust did not. A week later, Ethan came to visit. Unlike previous conversations, this one felt different. Lighter, more honest. We sat together at my dining room table drinking coffee. Neither of us rushed to fill the silence. Healing, I was learning, often happens quietly. Eventually, Ethan spoke. I still don't understand why he did it. The question lingered in the air. I had asked myself the same thing countless times. Why? Why risk everything? Why betray the people closest to him? Why build an entire second life after a long pause? I answered, honestly. I don't think it started that way. Ethan looked at me. What do you mean? I think your father made one bad decision. I stared out the window, then continued. Then another pause. Then another. Ethan nodded slowly. Because he understood. Most disasters don't begin with catastrophe. They begin with small compromises, small lies, small choices, until eventually the person making them no longer recognizes who they've become. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan surprised me. You know, Mom. What? A sad smile crossed his face. When I was younger, I really believed Dad knew everything. I laughed softly. So did I. That answer seemed to comfort him, not because it excused anything, because it reminded him that people can be fooled by those they love, even intelligent people. Especially intelligent people. A few weeks later, Megan flew in from Colorado. The three of us spent an entire weekend together. Just us. No attorneys. No investigations. No Richard. No drama. For the first time in years, we felt like a family again. Different. Smaller. Damaged. But real. One afternoon, while walking through town, Megan asked a question. What are you going to do now? The answer surprised even me. I'm leaving. Both children stopped walking. What? I smiled. Not leaving you? Then I pointed toward the horizon. I'm leaving this house. The decision had been forming quietly for months. At first, I resisted it. The house contained memories. Decades of memories. Good memories. Important memories. But it also contained pain. Betrayal. Disappointment. Loss. Every room reminded me of something. Every hallway carried echoes of the past. Eventually, I realized something important. Healing didn't require punishment. It required space, and I could no longer find that space there. The decision shocked both children initially. Yet the more we discussed it, the more sense it made. Several months later, the house sold. The closing process felt strangely emotional. On the final day, I walked through every room alone. The kitchen, where family dinners happened. The staircase, where the children sat on Christmas mornings. The backyard, where birthday parties were held. I touched the walls. Opened old closets. Remembered forgotten moments. Then I said goodbye, not to the house, to the version of myself that lived there. The woman who spent years making herself smaller. The woman who accepted being underestimated. The woman who surrendered her voice. She deserved compassion, but she didn't belong in my future. My new home sat beside a quiet lake in a small Ohio town. Nothing extravagant. Nothing dramatic. Just peaceful. A modest house surrounded by trees. A front porch overlooking the water. Silence. Real silence. Not the tense silence that existed inside my marriage. The peaceful kind. The healing kind. The first morning after moving in, I carried a cup of coffee onto the porch and watched the sunrise. No attorneys. No investigations.
No hidden files, no lies, just sunlight reflecting across the lake. For the first time in a very long time, I felt free. Later that afternoon, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed Richard's name. Troy. I stared at it. The phone continued ringing, then stopped. A voicemail appeared moments later. I didn't listen to it, not immediately. Instead, I sat quietly on the porch, watching the water, listening to the wind moving through the trees, because something important had changed. For decades, Richard controlled the emotional rhythm of my life. His approval mattered. His opinions mattered. His moods mattered. Now they didn't. The voicemail remained unopened until the next day. And when I finally listened, I discovered something I never expected. Not anger. Not excuses. Not blame. Just loneliness. For the first time, Richard sounded like a man confronting himself. And strangely enough, that realization gave me peace. Not because he suffered, because I no longer needed him to. 1 year later, my life looked nothing like it had before. And for the first time in decades, that was a good thing. The small house by the lake had become more than a place to live. It had become a place to heal. Every morning, I woke to the sound of birds instead of anxiety. Every evening, I watched the sunset instead of worrying about secrets hidden behind closed doors. The peace still felt unfamiliar sometimes, but I was learning to trust it, learning to enjoy it, learning to believe I deserved it. The most surprising part wasn't the freedom. It was discovering who I was without constantly managing someone else's chaos. For so many years, my identity revolved around other people. Richard's wife, Ethan's mother, Megan's mother, the supportive spouse, the dependable caretaker, the woman who kept everything running smoothly. There is nothing wrong with those roles. I was proud of them. But somewhere along the way, I had forgotten there was a person underneath them. A person with her own voice, her own abilities, her own future. The process of finding that woman again turned out to be one of the greatest gifts of my life. It began accidentally. A few months after moving, I attended a community center event. The topic was retirement planning. Most people there were women close to my age, widows, divorcees, retirees, women trying to navigate financial decisions they had never been encouraged to understand. As I listened, something felt familiar. Several women spoke about relying completely on their husbands. Others admitted they didn't know where important documents were kept. One woman confessed she didn't even know the passwords to the family accounts. The room filled with nervous laughter. But underneath the laughter was fear. Real fear. And suddenly, I saw my former self sitting among them. The woman I used to be. The woman who trusted someone else to handle everything. The woman who believed asking questions made her difficult. The woman who convinced herself that staying uninformed was easier. That afternoon changed something inside me. A week later, I volunteered to lead a small workshop. Nothing formal, just basic information. Simple financial literacy, understanding statements, organizing records, protecting personal information, recognizing warning signs. The first session attracted 6 women. The second attracted 12. By the end of the year, more than 40 women attended regularly. Some brought notebooks, some brought questions, some brought tears, and every single one brought courage. Because learning something new at 60, 70, or 80 years old requires courage. One afternoon after class, an elderly woman approached me. She must have been nearly 80. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. I wish someone had taught me this 30 years ago. I smiled. So do I. Then she surprised me. She squeezed my hand and said, "Maybe that's why you're teaching it now." The words stayed with me long after she left. Maybe she was right. Maybe our hardest experiences become useful when we share them. Maybe pain becomes purpose. Maybe survival becomes service. Around that same time, my relationship with Ethan began to improve. Not quickly. Trust doesn't heal overnight, especially when it has been broken. But Ethan kept showing up. Literally. He visited often, called regularly, asked questions, listened. Most importantly, he stopped making excuses. One afternoon, we sat on my porch watching the lake. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Eventually, he said something simple. I still think about it. I knew exactly what he meant. The money, he nodded. The lies. His voice sounded heavy. I hate that I helped. I looked at my son, really looked at him. The guilt remained visible, but so did growth, and growth matters. People sometimes believe forgiveness requires forgetting. It doesn't. Forgiveness requires honesty, accountability, change. Ethan was doing all three, so I answered truthfully, I know. A long silence followed. Then I added, but you're not that person anymore. His eyes filled with emotion. Neither of us said anything else. We didn't need to. Across the country, Megan continued thriving. She visited frequently, called almost daily, filled my life with stories, laughter, and occasional unsolicited advice. Some things never change. And thank goodness for that. As for Richard, that chapter ended differently than many people expected. He wasn't arrested dramatically. He wasn't publicly destroyed. Life isn't always that cinematic. Instead, he faced consequences more personal than spectacular. Financial losses, professional damage, broken relationships, a reputation permanently altered. Most importantly, he lost the trust of the people who mattered most. The cost was enormous. Far greater than he imagined when those first secrets began. Several months after I moved, a letter arrived, handwritten. The return address immediately caught my attention. Richard. I stared at the envelope for a long time. Part of me considered throwing it away. Part of me wanted to open it immediately. Eventually, curiosity won. The letter wasn't long. There were no excuses. No attempts to justify what happened. No elaborate explanations. Instead, there was something I never expected. Responsibility. For perhaps the first time in his life, Richard wrote honestly. He admitted his mistakes. He acknowledged the damage. He apologized.
Not only for the affair, not only for the financial decisions, but for something deeper. For spending years making me feel small. For convincing others to underestimate me. For treating intelligence as a threat instead of a gift. When I finished reading, I sat quietly for several minutes. The lake shimmered beyond my window. A soft breeze moved through the trees. The world felt peaceful. And suddenly I realized something important. I didn't need the apology. Not anymore. That didn't mean it lacked value. It simply meant my healing no longer depended on it. For years, I thought closure would come from Richard understanding what he had done. In reality, closure arrived when I stopped needing his understanding. When I stopped needing his approval. When I stopped allowing his opinion to define my worth. The letter folded neatly back into its envelope. Then I placed it inside a drawer. Not hidden, not displayed, just stored, like a chapter that belonged to the past. Sometimes people ask me what the greatest victory was. Was it protecting my finances? Was it exposing the truth? Was it watching Richard face consequences? The answer surprises them. No. The greatest victory wasn't any of those things. The greatest victory was remembering who I was. Before the lies. Before the manipulation. Before the years spent shrinking myself. I remembered that I was intelligent, capable, resilient, worth listening to, worth respecting, worth protecting. And once I remembered those things, everything else changed. Because the most valuable account I recovered wasn't in a bank. It was my confidence. And unlike the accounts Richard lost, nobody could ever freeze that again. Sometimes the most dangerous lie isn't the one someone tells about money. It's the one they tell about you. For years, I allowed another person to define my abilities. I allowed someone else's opinion to become louder than my own voice. I convinced myself that trust meant stepping back and letting someone else take control. What I learned is that trust and awareness are not opposites. You can love someone and still ask questions. You can support someone and still protect yourself. You can be kind without being blind. No matter your age, it is never too late to learn. It is never too late to become more confident. It is never too late to understand your finances, protect your future, or rebuild your life. Many women spend decades caring for everyone around them while forgetting to care for themselves. There is beauty in generosity, but there must also be wisdom. Your voice matters. Your knowledge matters. Your future matters. And perhaps the most important lesson of all is this: your value does not depend on whether someone recognizes it. You are valuable even when you are underestimated. You are capable even when others doubt you. You are strong even when life tries to convince you otherwise. If my story touched you in any way, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been underestimated by someone you trusted? What would you have done in my situation? Leave a comment below and share your experience. Your story may encourage someone else who needs strength today. And if you enjoy heartfelt family dramas with meaningful life lessons, Please subscribe and join our community. Thank you for spending this time with me.